Hi there, welcome back. We have two different paths that we can choose to go right now. The first one is to implement the movie information page, meaning when you click on a movie, we need to be able to see all the information about that specific movie. The other option is to create the My Profile page. That way, we'll be able to log in, register, and see all of the movies that we like or add to our wish list. It doesn't really matter which path do we choose at the moment, because we're going to implement both features anyway. But let's go with My Profile first. That's going to allow us to add the login and register logic using TMDB API. So let's implement that right away. So where are we going to start with the implementation of our login and registration? Well, think about it. Where do we click the login button? That's going to be inside of the navbar and right here on the login button on click. In here, we have to implement that functionality. So on click, we want to call a function, and the name of that function is going to be fetch token. We need to fetch the token to be able to log in or register. So now let's scroll to the top and let's implement that fetch token function. Since the fetch token function includes a lot of logic, and we don't want to mix the logic with the presentation here with the JSX, we're going to create that new function outside of the navbar file. We are going to create a new folder in the source folder called utils. That means utility functions, special functions that we can use across our code. So right here, let's create a new file called index.js. Inside of here, we can create that function called fetch token, and that's going to be an async function. We can also export it right away because we're going to use it elsewhere. So what are we going to do in this fetch token function? Well, we need to make a call to the movie database, that API that we're using. In this case, we won't use Redux Toolkit, we're just going to use plain Axios to make a call. So we can say import Axios from Axios. And then we need to create an instance of that Axios call, which is going to be const movies API is equal to axios.create, and then we pass in an object with all the settings. We have to provide a base URL, which we can copy from our services, TMDB, and right here we can copy this base URL and paste it here as a string. Then we also can provide parameters. Params is going to be equal to, and then in here we can provide the API key, and that is stored under process.env. And then we can also take a look in services. That's going to be react_app_tmdb_key. We've now created the Axios instance that we can make the calls to. So which calls do we want to make? Well, inside of the fetch token function, let's create a try and catch block. Inside of that block, we need to be able to make a request. So we can say const. We usually get a response when we do a request. Now we can say await movies API, and we want to make a simple get call. That get call is going to be made to a string that goes like this: /authentication, and then /token, and then /new. There we go. This is the call we want to make. And how did I know that we need to call this API? Well, let me show you. We are again on the movie database API documentation page, and then in here, the second thing from the top, authentication. In here, everything is explained. How you have to create a new request token, get the user to authorize using that request token, and then create a new session ID. So the entire process is explained here. And in here, if you click request token, you should be able to see that we need to make a call to authentication token new. There we go. So everything works as planned. So we don't necessarily need the response. We need just to get the data object from that response so we can destructure it. And then we can get the token by saying const token is equal to data.request_token. Finally, we want to say if data.success In that case, we want to do something. We want to log the user in. And if the request errors out, then we're going to go here and we can say console log, something like sorry, your token could not be created, something like that. So the question is, what are we going to do if we get the user token? Well, we can simply set it to local storage. So we can say local storage dot set item. We're going to call it request underscore token, and we're going to populate it with the token variable. Finally, we have to use that token to redirect to a special page. We can even get the information about that right here. We've just done the first step, which is to create a request token, and then we need to ask for the permission, and finally we have to redirect. So this is the URL we need to redirect to. So let's copy that. We can do window.location.href is equal to, and then we simply want to point to this string. That's going to be https://themoviedb.org authenticate, and then in here we have to pass our request token. So we can turn this into a template string. This here is going to be our token, and then we can say redirect to, and in this case we want to redirect to, let's fix that. We need to remove this, and that's simply going to be window.location.origin. That is the URL of our site, and then /approved. So essentially, we're just doing the steps that we're told right here to successfully generate a session ID. And it's spread into 3 different steps. We have to create a request token, which we're doing with this specific request. Then the second step is to get the token, ask for permission, and then redirect. And now we have to just create a session ID. So let's see what do we have right now. Let's see if our code is done correctly. It is. What we're doing is simply making a request to authenticate a new token, get a token, and then we are redirecting to the MovieDB authenticate with that specific token. With that said, we have to export our fetch token function and then use it right inside of here. So inside of the navbar, we can import it by saying import fetch token, and that's coming from //utils. Great. And what we're doing is simply calling that fetch token function once we click this button. Let's go ahead and test it out. I've reloaded the page and I'm going to click My Movies. There we go, we can see just profile. That means that we have a logical mistake in our code. We're currently showing this My Movies button, but we're not showing the login. So let's see why that is the case. Currently, we're saying if not is authenticated, then show the login. So what is this is authenticated variable equal to? Well, we are right now setting it to true, and at the start, it should be set to false. So let's go ahead and check it out now. There we go. Now we have a login button. Let's go ahead and click it. And it looks like to me that nothing happens. Let's open up the inspect element, go to the console, and we have 3 errors. Let's try to reload the page one more time and go to something like popular and click login one more time. There we go, we have a 404 not found. We're trying to get localhost 3000, authentication, new, and then the API key. But that is not the route we should be making the request to. So let's go back here and see if we're properly setting this. Movies API, base URL is this, and then we're simply doing movies API.get. This seems all right to me. And yeah, it looks like it's disregarding our base URL. Interesting. What I've noticed right now is that this here should have been base URL. URL all capitalized. So again, these are the issues that you could spend hours and hours wondering where the issue is, but it's right in front of you. We just had to read the Axios docs and find out that this is base URL. But again, to troubleshoot this issue, I've noticed, okay, we're making a request to localhost 3000 and then this, which means that the request is half right, but the problem is in the base URL. And then if you notice that, you can easily find the issue. With that said, let's save it and test it one more time. I'm going to reload the page and click login. And there we go. we are immediately redirected to the movie database and we can click Approve. Once you click Approve, we should be redirected back, but this little flag here should say Approved is equal to True. Great. These were just the two first steps to our authentication. Now we have to create a session ID. They say here, by calling the new session method with the request token that has been approved, the user in step 2, right here, they say, by calling the new session method with the request token that has been approved by the user in step 2, we will return a new session ID. This is the session that can now be used to write user data. You should treat this key like a password and keep it secret. So we're going to do just that. So we can create a second utility function right here below this one. That's going to be export const get session ID. And that's going to be equal to an async function. We're going to get the token, const token, from local storage. So that's going to be local storage.getItem request token. Then we're going to check if we have the token. So we're going to say if token. In that case, right here, if I fix this, then we can try to generate that session ID by opening a new try and catch block. Inside of the try, we can get our response first by saying const response is equal to movies API dot post. Again, you can find this URL in the TMDB docs. In here, we have to do authentication /session/new. Great. And we also have to pass a second parameter right here, which is an object where we can say request token is token. Just like that. Make sure to put an underline right here. And we're getting back the response, but we don't need the response. We can destructure it to get the data, and then we can destructure the data one more time to get a session underscore ID. Great. Now that we get that session ID, we're going to store it into local storage. So we can say local storage dot set item session underscore ID, and that's going to be session underscore ID. And finally, we can also return the session underscore ID. Finally, in the catch, we can simply console log the error. Great. Now we have the function to get the session ID as well as to fetch the token. So let's go back to our navigation bar. And now you might be wondering, where are we actually going to try to log in our user? When is that going to happen? On which button click? If you think about it, right now, we've been just redirected. So if you click login, we can click approve, and then we're going to get redirected back to our page. And only on that redirect, we want this to happen. So we're going to call that function inside of the use effect. Right here, we can create a new use effect. It's going to have a callback function and a dependency array. Inside of that dependency array, we can have our token. The token is going to be fetched from local storage. So we can say right here, const token is equal to local storage dot get item, and I think we've named it request underscore token. Let's go ahead to make sure request underscore token. Great. So we only want to recall this use effect whenever our token changes. We also need to import use effect at the top. And inside of there, we're going to have an async function. So we can say const log in user. That's going to be an async function. And inside of there, we want to check if token exists. And if that's the case, we also need to check if local storage session ID exists. So we can say if local storage dot get item session underscore ID. We could have also extracted that right here by saying session ID is equal to local storage that get item session ID. That way we can simply say if session ID. So if token exists and if session ID exists, in that case, we want to get the user data. We can do that by saying const. We can destructure the data and we can rename it to user data just so it makes more sense. That's going to be equal to await. And then we want to call that same API we've called here, movies API. So what we can do is we can simply export it. Right here, we can say export const movie API. And now in our navbar, we can use the get session ID, and we can also use movies API. So right here, we can say movies API dot get, and that's going to be /account session underscore ID is equal to session ID. But again, make sure that you're in a template string so that we can use this variable right here. And that's going to be our function call where we're going to get back the user data. This part that we've just coded out is not going to be the thing that we need right now. This is only going to happen if we already have the token and if we have the session ID. But at the start, we won't have the session ID. So what we have to do is say else. In that case, we don't have the session ID and we need to create it. But thankfully, if you think about it, we already created the function that's going to do just that, create a session ID. So this might not be the best name. This is going to create a new session ID. So we can rename that right away, create session ID, and we can rename it here as well. And then we can say const session token is going to be equal to await create session ID. Let me see if it's a token or an ID. Yep, it's definitely ID. So I'm going to rename this from session token to session ID. But then we have the same name, so I can rename the upper one to be session ID from local storage. Again, I know it's a long variable, but it's better to have it long and meaningful than short and unmeaningful. So now it's pretty clear that we're only getting into this if we already have the session ID from local storage, and we're going here if we need to create a new session ID. And then once we get that session ID, we can make this same call. So we can paste it right here. Const user data await movies API dot get, and this is not going to be session ID from local storage. It's just going to be session ID. That's going to be it. But now we have to actually dispatch this user data because we want to keep this user data in Redux state. So that's going to be our next step, to create a setUser function and a slice in the state. So we can go to our features and we're going to create a new feature right here. We had a slice for genres and categories. Now we're going to create a new slice called auth, as in authentication. Inside of here, we can import, same thing as before, that's going to be create slice from add redux.js/toolkit. Then we can create the initial state, and in this case, that initial state is going to be an object where we're gonna have a user. So let's put it like this. User is going to be an empty object at the start. Is authenticated property is going to be set to false at the start, and then the session ID is going to be empty at the start. Then we have to create a new auth slice. So we can say auth slice is equal to create slice, and then we have to provide options. Name is going to be set to user. Initial state is going to be set to initial state. So we can just leave it like this. And then we have to add our reducers. There's going to be just one reducer called set user, and it's going to be the same as before. It's going to be a function where we get the state as the first parameter and then the action as the second one. Now that we have this function, remember what we said before, we can say export const set user, and that's going to be equal to auth slice dot actions. So this action is automatically created for us as soon as we create the slice. Then we can also export default the entire auth slice.reducer so that we can connect it to a Redux store. And then there's the third thing, which is a neat little trick. And it goes like this. Export const user selector. And that's going to be equal to a function where we get the entire state and we only pull the user out of it. That is the same thing that we've done in the movies right here. So if we go to the movies, you can see that we use the selector and it looks basically the same. We have the state and then we just get the current genres. This is going to just simplify the process just a bit for us because we won't have to do it in the component, we can do it straight in here. Now let's connect this reducer to our store. We can do that inside of our app, and we can do it simply by following the procedure we have so far. That means duplicating this and renaming it to auth. Then we can simply say user is equal to user reducer. And yes, it would make sense to call this user reducer as well. Great. Again, this is just naming. You can name this anything you want. So now that we have this, we can actually finally use our setUser function, which so far doesn't do anything, but we can call it. So let's go here. And basically what we want to do is when we create the session ID and when we get the user data, we simply want to dispatch an action. So to dispatch an action, you already learned how to do that. We have to import use dispatch, and that's going to be imported from React Redux. So import use dispatch and also use selector. That's going to be imported from React-Redux, and we don't need this at the start. Then in here, we can say const dispatch is equal to, that's going to be use dispatch. Finally, we can call it in here, and we can say dispatch. What do we want to dispatch? Well, that's going to be the setUser action. So we first have to import that setUser action right here by saying import setUser as well as the user selector, if you remember that. And that's going to be imported from /features auth. Great. Now, what do we want to dispatch? Well, we want to dispatch setUser where we pass the user data. And we want to do the same thing right here when we log in the second time and when we get the session ID from local storage. Now we have to go back to our auth, and through action.payload, we're getting the entire user data. So what we can say is state.user is equal to action.payload. Also, state.isAuthenticated is equal to true because we're now logged in. And finally, state.sessionID is going to be equal to local storage .get item session underscore ID. And finally, once we have all of that, we can also add one final item to local storage, and that's going to be local storage.setItem account ID. And that's going to be equal to payload.id. We get that from the user, and this should have been action.payload.id. Great. So now in the navigation bar, we are actually getting the token. Then we're checking if we have the session ID. At the first time, we won't have it. So we're going to generate a new session ID, and then we're going to use that session ID to make a call to get the user's account. Then we're going to set that user account to our Redux store. I know it's a bit complicated, but hopefully it makes some sense. Finally, we need to just call this function right here, log in user. That's it. Finally, if we've done everything correctly, we can fetch this data from the store. We can fetch the user data, we can fetch the isAuthenticated, and the session ID. So right here at the top, we can say const isAuthenticated, as well as the user object that's equal to use selector. And now we could do state like this, and then we can say, give us just the state.auth like this. But we don't need to do that because we already have this neat little variable, which is the user selector right here. So we can say use selector, user selector, and we're immediately going to get the user and the isAuthenticated state. Now we don't need this dummy variable, which is always set to false, because we have the real isAuthenticated state. And what are we going to do with this user object? Well, we can simply console log that user for now. We've made a lot of changes, and it was a lot of logic, so hopefully it makes sense. I'll try to go over all of this at the end of the lecture one more time, but now let's test it out. I'm going to delete this URL and just reload the page one more time. And it looks like we are already logged in because it remembered our last sign in. So let's go to inspect, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to go to application and I'm going to clear site data. That's going to remove our local storage and so on. Now I'm going to reload the page. And there we go. We can see the login. Now let's click the login button. It's going to ask us to authenticate. I'm going to click approve. And we should get redirected back. And it should log us in, but unfortunately we can still see just login. Let me reload the page, maybe that fixes it. But unfortunately, we can still see just the login. So now might be a good time to start inspecting a bit and see what happens. In our console, we have 401s right now, and we have some sort of an object in the navigation bar, which seems to be empty. So let's start from the beginning. Let's click login. We are greeted right here, and let's click approve. Once we get back, we have two errors. It's saying 401, it cannot make a GET request because our session ID is undefined. As you can see right here, we're trying to make a GET request to session ID undefined. So let's see why that is undefined. That request is being made either here or here. So we're not quite certain where is it. So I'm going to add a console log right here. And the first one is going to say 1, the second one is going to say 2. So I'll try to clear this, click login, approve, and then in the console we get 1. So it means that it's going into 1. And the only reason why it could go into 1 is it because it thinks that it has the session ID already stored under local storage. But we can actually check that if we go to local storage, and it says session ID is equal to undefined. So it doesn't have it, but technically it does because undefined is a string value. So maybe that's why it thinks it has it. So where are we filling in the session ID as undefined? That's what we have to check. Well, it could be in the index of our utils. So right here, we are actually setting the local storage, that set item, session ID with the session ID right here. So is it possible that this is coming up as undefined? Well, of course. Look at this. Well, I have a typo. Request. That's definitely not request. So we have to fix that. Request token. And if we've done that correctly, this now shouldn't be undefined and everything should work. Again, I'm not going to delete this from the video and the course because this happens to everybody. And that's the main point I want to teach you. We just have to be able to debug things really quickly and on the go. As you've noticed, I was just wondering, where are we setting the session ID to the local storage? And we're doing that only here. That means that this must be undefined. And why would this return undefined? Well, something must be wrong here. So that's how I just debugged this in about 30 seconds, and you can as well. Let's go ahead and test it one more time. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to click login. I'm going to approve, and we get back, but still it says login. It doesn't say my movies. So let's see what's happening now. Again, a 401. Authentication failed. Let's simply reload the page one more time and then check it out. I'm going to click login, approve. We again get 1. And in here, the session ID is still undefined. And the reason for that might be because I haven't cleared my application tab. So I'm going to clear it, and let's try 1 and hopefully final time. I'm going to click login, approve, and there we go. We can see my movies now, which means that it has been redirected. We are successfully logged in, and we are now getting into 2 because we have created a new account and we have fetched a new session ID. And there we go. We're getting our avatar. This is the JavaScript Mastery logo, and the name is JS Mastery Pro. Amazing. we've just finalized the login and registration process using the Movie Database API. And the reason why I decided to go with their login system and not create a completely custom user account using Mern or something like that is because it's so convenient. They're going to allow us to like certain movies or add them to the watch list. With that said, we're logged in, and even if you reload the page, you can see that it's still going to be logged in because we're fetching the data from local storage. You can see that we're not properly setting this ID here, so once we actually click My Movies, we should now go to the correct ID. And before we couldn't have done that because we didn't have the ID, but now we do. So if we go back to our navigation bar and check the My Movies button, which is right here, now we can redirect to something meaningful. So let's see where we're doing that redirect. We can check for something like to equal to, and there we go. Profile ID. Now it's going to be simple. Let's make this into a template string, and our ID is going to be user.id because now we're getting that user object. So we are going to then redirect to the profile page, and then we are showing for now just this, an empty profile. And that's completely fine for now. Let's just see if our URL changes correctly. If we go back here, I'm gonna click My Movies one more time, and there we go. If you can see that at the top, it says profile and then my specific ID. That is going to be it for this lecture. But I have one short assignment for you. Can you try fetching the user ID or a username right inside of the profile component from our state? So I'm going to type it out. The goal is going to be to get access to profile name, let's say, or ID from Redux state, and then try to display it in the profile component. So right here, say profile, and then something like the name of the profile we're on. So your goal is to try to select the data from Redux state and then display it here. We're already doing that somewhere, so think about it and try to use the Redux knowledge you gained so far to display user's name or ID. Good luck, and hopefully you'll be successful. That's going to be it for this lecture. It was quite a long one, so great job on actually implementing the authentication with me. You can try doing this exercise now or later, and then the next lecture is just going to be my short explanation of how you could have solved the assignment if you had some issues with it. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next one.